when Daniel was just 12 years old. His world shattered in the span of a single car accident. His parents died instantly, leaving him to raise his three younger siblings, Emma, 8, Michael, 6, and little Sophie, only 4 years old. While other kids his age worried about homework and video games, Daniel became a father figure overnight, working part-time jobs to keep food on the table, helping with homework, attending parent-teacher conferences, and sacrificing his entire adolescence to keep his family together. For 15 years, he gave everything he had to ensure his siblings could have normal childhoods, even as his own dreams of college and career slowly withered away. He celebrated their graduations, supported their college educations, and watched with pride as they built successful lives. Emma became a doctor, Michael a successful businessman, and Sophie a talented artist. But when their elderly guardian aunt passes away and leaves behind a substantial inheritance, Daniel discovers the ultimate betrayal. The will divides everything equally among Emma, Michael, and Sophie, with no mention of Daniel whatsoever. In their family's eyes, the brother who raised them, who sacrificed everything for their futures, who was more of a father to them than their biological father ever had the chance to be, simply doesn't exist. As Daniel confronts his siblings about this devastating exclusion, he's met with cold justifications and rewritten history. They claim he chose to be their caretaker, that they never asked for his sacrifice, that he shouldn't expect gratitude for doing what was necessary. Now, at 35, with no inheritance, no acknowledgement of his sacrifice, and siblings who treat him like a distant relative, Daniel must confront the painful reality that the children he loved and raised have grown into adults who see his devotion as obligation rather than love. This is a story of a boy who became a man too soon, who gave his siblings everything, only to discover that in their minds, he was never really family at all. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what you think about this heartbreaking family situation. Have you ever sacrificed everything for people who later acted like your efforts meant nothing? The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of call that splits your life into before and after. I was 12 years old, fast asleep in my bed in our small house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, when the ringing phone jolted me awake. I lay there listening to my father's groggy voice answering, then the long silence that followed, then the sound I had never heard before and would never forget, my dad crying. 23 years have passed since that night, but I can still remember every detail with crystalline clarity. The way the moonlight streamed through my bedroom curtains, the sound of my parents' hushed, desperate conversation drifting down the hallway, the moment my door creaked open, and I saw my mother's tear-stained face illuminated by the hallway light. "Danny," she whispered, her voice breaking on my name. "We need to go to the hospital. There's been an accident." I didn't understand then that I was about to lose everything. My childhood, my parents, my carefree existence as the eldest of 4 kids in a loving middle-class family. I didn't know that in a few hours I would become something I was never meant to be, a father at 12 years old. The accident happened on Interstate 80, just outside of Iowa City. My Aunt Margaret and Uncle James were driving back from a wedding when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into their car at 60 miles per hour. They were killed instantly. The brother my father adored and the woman who had helped raise us kids when money was tight and babysitters were scarce. They were the only relatives we had in the world, the people my parents had named as our guardians in their will, never imagining that someday those papers would actually matter. At the hospital, I sat in those awful plastic chairs while my parents spoke in urgent whispers with doctors, police officers, and social workers. Emma, who was 8, kept asking why everyone was crying. Michael, only 6, had fallen asleep in my lap, his small body warm and trusting against my chest. And Sophie, my precious baby sister who had just turned 4, was quietly playing with the buttons on my shirt, completely unaware that our world was about to change forever. The next 2 weeks were a blur of funeral arrangements, lawyer meetings, and hush phone conversations between my parents about what we're going to do. I learned words that no 12-year-old should have to understand: guardianship, life insurance policies, estate planning. I watched my parents age 10 years in 2 weeks, saw the way they looked at us 4 kids with a mixture of overwhelming love and paralyzing fear. My father worked construction. My mother was a part-time secretary at the elementary school. We lived paycheck to paycheck in a 3-bedroom house that was already too small for our family of 6. The idea of taking in 3 more children, my orphan cousins, seemed financially impossible, but my parents never hesitated. Not once did I hear them discuss any alternative. Family takes care of family. My father said simply when the social worker asked if they were certain about accepting guardianship. Those kids have already lost enough. So Emma, Michael, and Sophie came to live with us. 3 traumatized children who cried themselves to sleep every night for their dead parents. Our house became a chaotic maze of sleeping bags, shared bedrooms, and not enough of anything to go around. My parents did their best, but the strain was immediate and crushing. 7 kids in a 3-bedroom house meant Emma and Sophie shared a room with my younger sister. The boys doubled up in my room, and privacy became a foreign concept. Breakfast was a military operation of rationed cereal and toast. The grocery bill tripled overnight. My mother's part-time job became full-time, and my father started working every weekend and holiday he could get. But it was more than just the practical challenges. Emma had nightmares every night, screaming for her mommy until someone could comfort her back to sleep. Michael developed a stutter and stopped speaking for weeks at a time. Sophie, who had been potty trained for over a year, started having accidents again. They were 3 broken little souls who needed more love, attention, and therapy than our overwhelmed parents could possibly provide. I watched my father's shoulders bow under the weight of supporting 7 people on a construction worker's salary. I saw my mother crying quietly at the kitchen table as she tried to stretch our food budget to cover 7 growing children. And I made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of my life. I decided to help in whatever way I could. It started small. I began getting up early to help pack lunches, walking the younger kids to school so my mother didn't have to load everyone in the car, staying home to babysit when my parents needed to run errands. I was the oldest, the most responsible, the one everyone naturally turned to when there was a problem to solve or a crisis to manage. When Emma had nightmares, I was the one who would sit with her until she fell back asleep. When Michael got in fights at school because other kids teased him about being an orphan, I was the one who helped him practice what to say the next time. When Sophie missed her real mommy, I was the one who would read her stories and brush her hair the way Aunt Margaret used to do. My parents were grateful for the help, but I don't think they fully understood how much responsibility I was taking on. They were so exhausted, so overwhelmed with keeping food on the table and a roof over our heads, that they didn't notice I had stopped being a child. I stopped asking for help with homework. I stopped complaining when I didn't get things I wanted. I stopped being a kid who needed parenting and became a kid who provided it. The summer I turned 13, everything changed again. My father was injured on a construction site, a bad fall that shattered his left leg and put him out of work for 4 months. Suddenly, our already precarious financial situation became desperate. Workman's compensation covered only a fraction of his lost wages, and my mother's secretary's salary wasn't nearly enough to support 7 people. That's when I got my first job, washing dishes at Murphy's Diner 3 evenings a week. I lied about my age, told them I was 15, and worked 4-hour shifts after school to bring home whatever money I could. Every dollar I earned went straight to the family fund. Groceries, utilities, school supplies for the younger kids. My parents protested at first, said I was too young to work, that I should be focusing on school and being a normal teenager. But when the electric company threatened to shut off our power and there wasn't enough money for both the bill and groceries that week, their objections quietly disappeared. We needed every penny I could earn, and everyone knew it. By the time I was 14, I was working 2 jobs, dishwasher at the diner and stock boy at the local grocery store, and bringing home nearly $200 a week. It wasn't much, but it was the difference between having milk in the refrigerator and going without. It was the difference between the younger kids having decent clothes for school and showing up in hand-me-downs that were too small and too worn. My own education suffered. Inevitably, I was too tired to focus in class, too busy working to participate in extracurricular activities, too stressed about family finances to worry about things like college prep courses or SAT scores. My grades weren't bad, but they weren't good enough for scholarships, and everyone understood that college was a luxury we couldn't afford anyway. While my classmates worried about prom dates and senior pictures, I worried about whether Emma would need braces, whether Michael's chronic asthma medication would be covered by our insurance, whether Sophie would be able to afford the art supplies she needed for her advanced classes. I became fluent in the language of bills and budgets, insurance claims and payment plans. The responsibility was crushing, but I convinced myself it was temporary. Once my father's leg healed completely, once my mother could find a better-paying job, once the youngest kids were a little older and required less supervision, then I could focus on my own future. There was always some milestone on the horizon that would mark the end of my premature adulthood. But those milestones kept shifting. Dad's leg never quite healed properly, leaving him with chronic pain that limited the kind of construction work he could do. Mom developed stress-related health problems that required expensive medication and frequent doctor visits. And just as the kids were getting older and easier to manage, new challenges emerged. Emma needed tutoring to keep up in her advanced math classes. Michael showed signs of being gifted, but required special programs that cost money we didn't have. Sophie displayed remarkable artistic talent, but needed supplies, lessons, and encouragement that stretched our budget even further. Every achievement, every opportunity, every sign that the kids were thriving despite their tragic start came with a price tag that fell to me to help cover. I was 17 when I made the decision that would define the rest of my 20s. I had been accepted to Iowa State University with partial financial aid, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream about having my own life. I imagined studying engineering, living in a dorm, making friends who knew nothing about my complicated family situation. I pictured myself as a normal college student, worried about normal things like exams and relationships instead of whether there was enough money for everyone's school clothes. But the acceptance letter came at the same time as Sophie's diagnosis with a learning disability that would require expensive special education services. The same week I was supposed to confirm my enrollment, Emma was accepted into an elite high school program that would prepare her for pre-med studies, but required fees we couldn't afford. Michael needed emergency dental work after a playground accident broke 2 of his front teeth. The choice was obvious, even if it broke my heart. I deferred my acceptance, picked up a 3rd part-time job, and watched my dreams of college disappear into the endless black hole of family expenses. My parents felt terrible about it, especially my mother, who cried when I told her my decision. "This isn't fair to you, Danny," she said through her tears. "You shouldn't have to sacrifice your future for us." But what was the alternative? Let Emma give up her chance at medical school? force Michael to go through high school with broken teeth, deny Sophie the help she needed to overcome her learning challenges. These were my biological children, but I loved them as if they were. Their success felt like my success, their opportunities more important than my own. So I became a full-time adult at 17, working 40-plus hours a week at 3 different jobs while finishing high school at night. I managed a family's finances, coordinated doctor's appointments and parent-teacher conferences, and somehow found time to help with homework and attend school events. I was more of a father to those kids than many biological fathers ever are to their own children. The pattern continued through my 20s. Every time I thought about going back to school or pursuing my own career, some family crisis would emerge that required my attention and financial support. Emma needed help with college applications and tuition for her pre-med program. Michael wanted to start his own business and needed startup capital. Sophie was accepted to art school but couldn't afford the expensive supplies and studio fees. I told myself their success was worth my sacrifice. Watching Emma graduate medical school with honors, seeing Michael's business take off and become profitable, celebrating Sophie's first art gallery showing. These moments felt like my own achievements, proof that all the years of working multiple jobs and putting my own dreams on hold had been worthwhile. By the time I was 30, the kids were all adults with successful careers of their own. Emma was a practicing physician, Michael owned a thriving consulting firm, and Sophie was making a living as a freelance artist and graphic designer. They had all moved away. Emma to Chicago for her residency, Michael to Denver for business opportunities, Sophie to Portland for the art scene. They visited for holidays, called occasionally, sent birthday cards, but they had their own lives now, their own priorities. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I had the opportunity to focus on myself. But I was 30 years old with no college degree, no career prospects beyond entry-level positions, and no savings because every dollar I had earned for 18 years had gone to supporting my family. I was emotionally and financially depleted, with no clear path forward. The isolation was profound. The kids I had raised were busy with their own adult lives. My parents were aging and deal with their own health issues. And I had never had the time or energy to develop friendships or romantic relationships outside my family responsibilities. I had given my entire youth to ensuring everyone else's success, and now I was alone with nothing to show for it but the satisfaction of watching them thrive. I eventually found work as an office manager for a small insurance company, a decent job that paid enough for me to finally move into my own apartment and start thinking about my future. I enrolled in online college courses, slowly working toward the engineering degree I had dreamed about at 17. It was harder to learn at 30 than it would have been at 18, but I was determined to build some kind of life for myself. The kids stayed in touch, but our relationships had shifted in subtle ways that I tried not to think about too deeply. They saw me as a responsible older brother, the one who had always been there to solve problems and provide support, but not necessarily as someone who needed support in return. When they called, it was usually because they needed advice about something or wanted to share good news about their careers or relationships. They seemed to have forgotten, or perhaps had never fully understood, the extent of the sacrifices I had made for their success. In their minds, I think they saw my role as a natural order of things. I was the oldest, the most responsible, so of course I had taken care of them. They didn't seem to recognize that I had given up my own childhood, my education, my career prospects, my entire 20s to ensure they could have normal, successful lives. Emma occasionally made comments about how I should finally think about myself or stop being so selfless, as if my years of sacrifice had been a character flaw rather than necessity. Michael would suggest I should take more risks with my career, seemingly unaware that I had spent my prime earning years working entry-level jobs to support his education. Sophie would encourage me to find my passion, not understanding that my passion had been ensuring she could pursue hers. There was a painful irony in their success. The very achievements I had made possible had elevated them to a social and economic level where they could no longer fully relate to the struggles I continued to face. Emma's medical salary was more than I would ever earn in a year. Michael's business success afforded him luxuries I couldn't imagine. Sophie's artistic career, while modest by some standards, was still built on the foundation of the expensive education and opportunities one had helped provide. They had become the successful, educated, upper-middle-class adults I had always dreamed they could be. But in the process, they had also become people who seemed to view my ongoing financial struggles and limited opportunities with a kind of benevolent puzzlement, as if they couldn't quite understand why I hadn't managed to create the same kind of success for myself. The distance between us grew slowly, imperceptibly, over several years. They still invited me to their weddings, sent me pictures of their new houses and promotions, included me in family group texts about holiday plans. But I increasingly felt like a peripheral figure in their lives, the older brother who was always available for advice or emergency help, but who didn't quite fit into their new social circles. When Emma married a fellow physician, their wedding was an elegant affair full of doctors and medical professionals discussing cases and research I couldn't follow. When Michael bought his first house, it was in an exclusive subdivision where the neighbors were all successful business owners and executives. When Sophie had her first major art show, the opening was filled with collectors and gallery owners speaking in artistic terminology that was completely foreign to me. I was proud of them, genuinely proud, but I also felt increasingly like an outsider at my own family celebrations. I was the blue-collar brother among white-collar achievers, the one who had never quite managed to build the kind of life they all seemed to take for granted. The turning point came last spring, when our Aunt Margaret's sister, Eleanor, passed away at the age of 87. Eleanor had never married or had children of her own, and in the years since Margaret's death, she had maintained a relationship with our family, particularly with Emma, Michael, and Sophie. She would visit during holidays, send birthday gifts, and generally function as a doting great-aunt figure. Eleanor had done well for herself financially. She had worked as a nurse for 40 years, lived modestly, invested wisely, and accumulated a substantial estate worth nearly $800,000. More importantly, she owned a beautiful Victorian house in a desirable neighborhood that had appreciated significantly over the decades she had lived there. I knew Eleanor cared about the kids. She had followed their academic and career achievements with obvious pride, had contributed to their college funds over the years, and had always spoken glowingly about their successes. What I didn't expect was to discover that she had remembered them in her will. The call came from Eleanor's attorney on a rainy Thursday evening in May. Emma, Michael, and Sophie had all been named as beneficiaries in Eleanor's estate, each receiving an equal share of her assets and property. It was a significant inheritance, enough to pay off student loans, make down payments on houses, establish serious investment portfolios. The kids were thrilled, obviously. Emma called me that evening to share the news, her voice filled with excitement and gratitude for Eleanor's generosity. Michael sent a group text about how the inheritance would allow him to expand his business much faster than he had planned. Sophie posted on social media about being able to afford a proper art studio for the first time in her career. I was happy for them, genuinely happy. They were good people who had worked hard and deserved every success that came their way. If Eleanor wanted to help him achieve even more with her inheritance, that seemed like a wonderful way for her to be remembered. But as the weeks passed and the estate was settled, a small, uncomfortable thought began to gnaw at me. I had been part of this family for over 20 years. I had sacrificed my own opportunities to ensure Emma, Michael, and Sophie could become successful adults Eleanor was now rewarding with her inheritance. My labor, my earnings, my entire youth had been dedicated to making their achievements possible. It wasn't that I expected an inheritance. Eleanor had every right to leave her money to whomever she chose. But it stung to realize that in her mind, and apparently in the minds of the kids as well, I was somehow separate from the family she wanted to reward. I was the older brother who had made their success possible, but I wasn't quite family enough to be included in the benefits of that success. The feeling intensified when I learned more details about Eleanor's will. She had left specific instructions about how she wanted her inheritance to help the kids build better lives, paying for Emma's advanced medical training, supporting Michael's business expansion, funding Sophie's artistic career. Eleanor had clearly thought carefully about how her money could make the biggest impact on their futures. But there was no mention of me anywhere in the will or in her stated intentions. No recognition that the person who had made their achievements possible might also benefit from a little help building his own delayed dreams. No acknowledgement that the oldest brother who had sacrificed his own education and career might deserve some consideration as well. I tried to rationalize it. Eleanor was closer to the kids than to me. They were younger when she came into our lives, had more time to bond with her, probably seemed more like grandchildren than I did. I was already an adult when she became a regular part of our family, already working and independent, probably seeming less in need of support. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was part of a larger pattern. In everyone's mind, Eleanor's, the kids, probably even my parents, I had been relegated to a supporting role in this family story. I was a responsible older brother, the one who helped make everyone else's success possible, but not someone whose own dreams and struggles were particularly important or worthy of investment. The kids didn't seem to notice anything problematic about the inheritance distribution. They didn't suggest splitting it with me or even acknowledge that there might be something unfair about the situation. In their minds, they were the ones Eleanor had wanted to help, and that was that. Emma did mention, almost in passing, that I should be proud of the role I had played in their success. "We couldn't have done any of this without you, Danny," she said during a phone call about her plans to use part of her inheritance for additional medical training. "You really set us up to succeed." But there was something in her tone that suggested she viewed my sacrifice as natural, expected, unremarkable, like thanking someone for doing their job rather than recognizing an extraordinary gift. She seemed to see my years of financial support and emotional investment as something I had simply done because I was the oldest, not as a choice I had made that deserved recognition or reciprocation. That conversation haunted me for weeks. The more I replayed it, the more I realized that all three kids viewed my sacrifice through the same lens. They appreciated it in an abstract way, the way you might appreciate good weather or a helpful service, but they didn't seem to understand the personal cost I had exacted or feel any obligation to consider my welfare in return. I began to see our family dynamic with new clarity. For over 20 years, I had functioned as a parent figure to these three people, providing financial support, emotional guidance, and unconditional love. But unlike a parent, I had never received the kind of respect, gratitude, or consideration that parents typically get from successful adult children. They had taken my sacrifice for granted because I had always made it freely, without complaint, without keeping score. They had accepted my financial support and emotional investment as their due, not as extraordinary gifts that deserved extraordinary gratitude. And now that they were successful adults with their own resources, they seemed to view my continued financial struggles as my own responsibility, separate from their good fortune. The inheritance became a symbol of everything that was wrong with our relationships. Eleanor's decision to exclude me wasn't malicious. She probably never thought of me as someone who needed help, since I had always been the one providing it. But the kids' complete lack of concern about the fairness of that exclusion revealed how they really saw me, as a family member whose role was to give, not to receive. I spent months trying to decide whether to say anything about how I felt. Part of me knew that bringing it up would sound petty and grasping. The inheritance was Eleanor's to give, and she had chosen to give it to them. I had no legal or moral claim to her money, and asking for a share would make me seem greedy and entitled. But another part of me felt that staying silent would be a continuation of the same pattern that had defined our relationships for decades, me sacrificing my own needs and feelings to maintain family harmony, me accepting whatever scraps of consideration the others were willing to provide, me pretending that their success was enough reward for my investment. I was 35 years old, still living paycheck to paycheck, still working toward a college degree I should have completed 15 years earlier, still trying to build some kind of life for myself after spending 2 decades building lives for everyone else. Meanwhile, the people I had sacrificed were thriving financially and professionally, using an inheritance from a woman who had benefited from my years of unpaid labor to achieve even greater success. Finally, I decided to have a conversation with them, not to ask for money. I knew that ship had sailed, but to at least express how their complete indifference to my situation felt, and to see if they could understand why someone might find inheritance distribution hurtful. I planned the conversation carefully, choosing a time when we were all together for Thanksgiving. I waited until after dinner, when we were sitting around my parents' living room, the kids relaxed and happy from good food and family time. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say, trying to find words that would express my feelings without sounding accusatory or bitter. I've been thinking about Eleanor's will. I began carefully, and I wanted to share some thoughts about how it felt to be excluded from that. The room went quiet immediately. Emma looked uncomfortable, Michael seemed confused, and Sophie had that deer-in-headlights expression she always got when someone brought up difficult topics. I'm happy for all of you, I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. You deserve every good thing that comes your way. But it did hurt to realize that 20 years of helping to raise you and supporting your education and career goals somehow didn't make me enough of a family member to be considered for any part of Eleanor's gift to the family. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Emma spoke up. Danny, Eleanor barely knew you compared to how well she knew us. We spent way more time with her over the years. That's because I was working 3 jobs to help pay for your college. I replied, still trying to keep my tone conversational rather than confrontational. I didn't have time to build relationships with extended family members because I was too busy trying to keep this family afloat financially. Michael jumped in then, his voice taking on the slightly defensive tone he always used when he felt criticized. Nobody asked you to do that, Danny. You chose to take on that responsibility. We were just kids. We didn't make you work all those jobs or give up college. The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I had sacrificed, everything I had given up to ensure their success, Michael was framing my sacrifice as a choice I had made for my own reasons rather than a necessity imposed by our family circumstances. You're right, I said slowly. You were just kids, which is exactly my point. I was a kid too, but I became an adult at 12 because our family needed someone to step up. I didn't choose that responsibility in any meaningful sense. I accepted it because the alternative was watching all of you suffer. Sophie spoke for the first time, her voice small and uncomfortable. We're grateful for everything you did, Danny. We've always said that. Have you? I asked, genuinely curious. Because I honestly can't remember the last time any of you acknowledged what those years cost me or showed any interest in helping me build the kind of life I helped you build. That's not fair, Emma said, her voice rising slightly. We've all offered to help you over the years. You're the one who always says you don't need anything. I say I don't need anything because I've spent 23 years being the person who provides rather than the person who receives. I replied, I learned early that my role in this family was to solve problems, not have problems. So, yes, I've gotten very good at not needing anything from any of you. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. The kids became defensive, insisting that they had never asked for my sacrifice and shouldn't be held responsible for choices I had made as a teenager. They pointed out that I could have gone to college at any time, that I could have pursued my own career instead of working entry-level jobs, that my current situation was a result of my own decisions rather than their success. What hurt most was how they seemed genuinely unable to understand why Eleanor's inheritance distribution might feel exclusionary to me. In their minds, she had left money to her great-nieces and nephew, which I was not. The fact that I had functioned as more of a parent to them than their actual parents ever had the chance to be was irrelevant to the legal and social definitions of family that governed inheritance decisions. You're not actually our brother, Sophie said at one point, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I mean, you are, but you're not. You're our cousin. Eleanor was our great-aunt, not yours. The room fell silent after that comment. Even Sophie seemed to realize she had said something terrible. But the damage was done. She had articulated what I was beginning to suspect all three of them felt. Despite 20 years of functioning as their parent, despite sacrificing my entire youth for their welfare, despite loving them as much as any father ever loved his children, I was still just their cousin in their minds. The orphan kids taken in by our family, not really family themselves. I left that evening feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The three people I had devoted my life to raising had made it clear that they saw my sacrifice as optional, my current struggles as self-inflicted, and my relationship to them as fundamentally different from their relationships to each other. Over the following months, our interactions became increasingly strained. The kids seemed to feel that I was being unreasonable and ungrateful, focusing on money rather than appreciating the love and success we had built as a family. I felt that they were being obtuse and selfish, unable to acknowledge the unfairness of situation where the person who had made their success possible was excluded from benefiting from that success. Emma stopped calling as frequently. Michael became formal and distant during our conversations. Sophie seemed nervous whenever we were alone together, as if she was afraid I might bring up the inheritance again. The easy, affectionate relationships we had maintained for years began to fray under the weight of unspoken resentment and mismatched expectations. The final blow came 6 months later, when I learned about the next phase of their plans for Eleanor's inheritance. Emma was using her share to buy a house in an expensive neighborhood near the hospital where she worked. Michael was expanding his business and purchasing a vacation home in Colorado. Sophie was opening her own art gallery and studio space. None of them had mentioned these plans to me during our regular family conversations. I learned about them through social media posts and casual comments from my parents, who seemed to assume I already knew about my siblings' exciting new ventures. The exclusion felt deliberate this time. These were major life decisions, significant investments, exciting new chapters in their lives, and they were sharing them with everyone except the person who had made their success possible. I was being treated like a distant relative who warranted a Christmas card, but not an invitation to participate in their actual lives. That's when I realized that Eleanor's hadn't created a problem in our family relationships. It had simply revealed a problem that had existed for years in the kids' minds. I had always been a supportive older cousin, the helpful family member who could be counted on in a crisis, but who didn't require the same level of consideration and inclusion they showed each other. They had accepted my sacrifice as their due for so long that they had forgotten it was a sacrifice at all. They saw my financial support, emotional investment, and unconditional love as a natural order of things, not as extraordinary gifts that deserved extraordinary gratitude or reciprocation. And now that they were successful adults with their own resources, they felt free to exclude me from the next phase of their lives. They had taken everything I had to give, used it to build the foundations for their own success, and then moved on without a backward glance. I realized I had two choices. I could continue trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me as a supporting character in their life stories, accepting whatever scraps of attention and consideration they were willing to provide. Or I could finally admit that the children I had raised were not the adults I had hoped they would become, and start building a life that didn't revolve around people who would never see me as family in the way I had always seen them. The decision was heartbreaking, but inevitable. After 23 years of putting their needs before my own, it was time to finally put myself first. Not because I stopped loving them, but because continuing to love them was destroying any chance I had of building a life worth living. I started by changing my phone number and not giving them the new one. I deleted them from my social media accounts and stopped following their updates about houses and businesses and gallery openings. I moved to a different city, 2 states away, and didn't tell anyone in the family where I was going. For the first time in my adult life, I am living entirely for myself. I'm 36 years old. Enrolled full-time in college using student loans I'll probably be paying off until I'm 50, but finally pursuing the engineering degree I dreamed about at 17. I work part-time at a campus job that pays barely enough to cover my expenses, and I've never been happier. Sometimes I wonder if the kids even noticed I disappeared from their lives. Maybe they assume I'm just busy or going through a phase, or finally taking their advice to focus on myself. Maybe they're relieved to be free from the one family member who remembered their obligations and expected something in return for decades of unconditional support. I hope they're happy with their inheritance-funded houses and businesses and art galleries. I hope they never have to sacrifice their dreams for anyone else's success. I hope they never have to discover what it feels like to give everything you have to people you love, only to learn that in their minds, you never really mattered at all. But I also hope that someday, when they have children of their own, they'll understand what I gave up for them. And maybe, if they're very lucky, their children will love them enough to make the same sacrifices I made, but wise enough to expect something better in return.